When news broke on October 11, 2025, that Diane Keaton had passed away at the age of 79, the world mourned an icon. But amid the outpouring of tributes and condolences, there was a hush around her two children, especially Dexter, the daughter she adopted in her 50s. For years, Dexter had lived largely out of the spotlight, offering only glimpses of her life through quiet social media tributes. Then, in the early hours after her mother's death was confirmed, Dexter made a short but startling statement, one that shocked many by its tone, content, and emotional depth. For the first time, the daughter who had remained silent opened a window into a private world of grief, love, and unspoken bonds. What she revealed in that moment sent ripples through Hollywood and beyond, raising more questions than answers and leaving countless viewers breathless. This video unravels the timeline of Diane Keaton's life and death, traces Dexter's journey from childhood to the edge of public grief, and carefully examines that shocking moment when silence was broken. Along the way, we'll uncover hidden facets, examine what is known versus what is speculation, and confront the truths that only now begin to emerge. What Dexter revealed would not only bring tears but would change how the world remembered her mother, forever. Long before she became a name that symbolized timeless grace and fierce independence, Diane Keaton was simply a dreamer. A girl from Los Angeles with a voice full of conviction and eyes that seemed to notice everything. From the very beginning, she stood apart. She didn't try to fit in, she never had to. Hollywood didn't shape her, she reshaped Hollywood. Her career began humbly, in small theater productions and uncredited roles that paid little but taught her everything about courage. Then came the turning point, Annie Hall. With that film, she didn't just act, she redefined what a leading woman could be. Quirky yet magnetic, unsure yet captivating, Diane embodied contradictions that made her real. She turned simplicity into style and imperfection into power. Audiences fell in love with her, but so did critics and directors. She became the muse of Woody Allen, the equal of Al Pacino, and the heart of every film she touched. Each role, from The Godfather to Something's Gotta Give, added a new shade to her legacy. She was never just the love interest or the comic relief. She was the story itself, unpredictable, complex, deeply human. But beyond the accolades and red carpets, there was a quiet rebellion that defined her. Diane never married, never conformed to Hollywood's expectations of what a woman should be. Instead, she lived by her own script. In interviews, she spoke about love and independence as two sides of the same coin, about choosing herself not out of pride, but out of peace. What the world didn't always see, though, was her deep longing for connection. Behind that confident smile was someone who believed in love, even when it broke her heart. Someone who dreamed of family, even as she chased her art. By the time she reached her 50s, Diane had already achieved everything most could only imagine: fame, wealth, respect. But something inside her whispered that there was still one role left to play, one she had waited her entire life for. And that role would change her forever. For most people, becoming a mother in their 50s might seem impossible. For Diane Keaton, it was destiny. She had spent years pouring herself into her work, the characters, the scripts, the endless lights of the movie set. But when the cameras stopped, she often found herself alone, wondering if she had waited too long to build the family she always dreamed of. Then, against all odds, she decided it wasn't too late. She adopted her first child, Dexter, in 1996, and later her son, Duke. It was a choice that surprised Hollywood and inspired millions. The image of Diane, once the symbol of carefree independence, now holding her baby daughter, was one of the most moving moments of her life. From that day on, the woman who had spent decades performing for audiences discovered her most meaningful role, being a mother. And she embraced it with the same passion she gave to every film. Only this time, there was no script, no director, no applause. Just love. Friends said she became softer, more grounded, more patient. She would talk endlessly about Dexter, her laughter, her curiosity, the way she lit up every room. In interviews, Diane would often mention that motherhood had saved her from herself. "You don't realize how much love you're capable of," she once said, her voice trembling slightly, "until you have someone who depends on you completely." As Dexter grew older, Diane juggled her Hollywood life and her responsibilities as a mother. But no matter how busy she became, she never let fame get in the way of family. She attended school events, helped with homework, and made sure her children knew that home was a place free of cameras and judgment. There was something almost poetic about seeing Diane, once the symbol of bold individuality, now finding her deepest purpose in nurturing others. Her decision to adopt later in life wasn't about filling a void, it was about fulfilling a promise to herself. A promise that love, no matter how late it arrives, can still transform everything. To the public, she remained the same witty, eccentric star. But to Dexter, she was simply mom. And that, above everything else, became the role she cherished most. Growing up as Diane Keaton's daughter might have meant endless attention, flashing cameras and constant headlines, but Dexter Keaton's life was anything but that. From the very beginning, Diane made one decision that would define her children's upbringing: to protect them from Hollywood. Dexter was raised in a world that valued normalcy over fame. Their home was filled with warmth, art, and laughter, but not extravagance. Diane believed in simplicity: long walks, homemade meals, quiet movie nights. She wanted her children to experience real life, not the illusion of it. Dexter attended regular schools, made ordinary friends, and lived far from the limelight. While other celebrity children graced red carpets and reality shows, Dexter preferred privacy. Even as an adult, she rarely shared glimpses of her life: a wedding photo here, a memory there, but always with dignity and restraint. Those who knew her described her as gentle, intelligent, and deeply loyal. Traits that mirrored her mother's heart more than her fame. Despite living outside the public eye, Dexter's bond with Diane remained unbreakable. They traveled together, laughed over morning coffee, and shared secrets that never reached the tabloids. Their connection wasn't loud or showy. It was quiet, built on trust, respect, and mutual admiration. Diane often called Dexter her compass, the person who grounded her when fame became too heavy. And Dexter saw her mother not as a star, but as a guide, flawed, funny, and endlessly loving. To outsiders, they seemed like opposites: one a Hollywood legend, the other a private soul. But to each other, they were everything. In many ways, Dexter's choice to live privately was a reflection of the values her mother had instilled. She didn't need the spotlight to find meaning. She didn't crave attention, only peace. And it was this quiet, unseen bond between mother and daughter that would later make Dexter's silence, and her eventual words, all the more powerful. Because when the time came for her to speak, the world would realize that behind Diane Keaton's laughter stood a daughter who had inherited her strength, and her silence, in equal measure. In the final weeks of her life, Diane Keaton seemed as luminous as ever, laughing, creating, and carrying the same disarming warmth that had made her beloved for generations. To the public eye, nothing appeared out of the ordinary. She attended a few small gatherings, took walks with her family, and even posted her usual blend of humor and candid thoughts about life. There were no signs, no warnings, only the graceful calm of a woman who had lived a full, remarkable life. But those closest to her noticed something different, something subtle. A quietness that lingered behind her smile. In conversations, she often drifted toward reflection, speaking not about future projects but about gratitude, about time, about memories that had shaped her. Friends later recalled that she seemed almost at peace, as though she was preparing for something only she understood. One evening, Dexter and Diane shared dinner at home, a simple meal, candles lit, music playing softly in the background. It was a familiar ritual between them, something they both treasured. Diane had always been sentimental about such moments. That night, she told her daughter how proud she was of the life Dexter had built, of the woman she had become, of the love she had found. It was tender, affectionate, yet oddly final. Dexter would later recall that her mother seemed unusually thoughtful that night. She had laughed, reminisced, and even offered one of her favorite sayings, one that now felt haunting. "Everything changes, my darling. And that's okay. The love doesn't go anywhere. It just changes form." At the time, Dexter thought little of it. Her mother was known for her poetic turns of phrase, her spontaneous bursts of philosophy. But in hindsight, those words would echo endlessly in her heart. In her last public appearance, Diane looked radiant. She spoke about joy, legacy, and the importance of living truthfully. "I've made peace with the woman I am," she said. "And I hope my children always feel free to do the same." The audience applauded, unaware that these would be some of her final words to the world. Behind closed doors, she spent her last days surrounded by the people she loved, her children, her close friends, and the familiar walls of her cherished home. She was writing, reading, laughing, and living as she always had, fully, beautifully, unapologetically herself. No one, not even Dexter, could have imagined that those would be their last ordinary days together. That one moment, one breath, one goodbye hug would carry so much meaning. And then, suddenly, silence. The news would break without warning, and the world would never be the same again. The morning the world woke to the news of Diane Keaton's death, time seemed to stand still. Headlines flooded every corner of the internet, television networks went live with tributes, and the air carried a heaviness that felt almost personal, as if everyone had lost someone they knew. Hollywood, a place that often moves too fast to pause for grief, stopped completely. Tributes poured in from co-stars, directors, and friends who had shared the screen and the stage with her. Al Pacino called her a light that could never be replaced. Woody Allen described her as a one-of-a-kind soul who brought warmth to every frame she touched. Younger stars who had grown up watching her films shared messages of admiration and heartbreak. Clips from Annie Hall, The Godfather, Something's Gotta Give, and countless other films played on every network. Her voice, her laugh, her unmistakable style, suddenly, they were everywhere. For many, it was too much to process. The loss wasn't just cinematic, it was deeply human. Fans gathered outside theaters, homes, and landmarks. Flowers were laid, candles were lit, handwritten notes left behind in trembling handwriting. Thank you for teaching us to be ourselves. Social media overflowed with memories, favorite scenes, personal reflections, decades-old interviews that suddenly felt prophetic. There was something about Diane that had always connected to people beyond fame. She made them feel seen. But amid all the chaos and heartbreak, one silence lingered: Dexter's. Reporters waited anxiously for a statement. They watched her accounts, hoping for any sign. Friends close to the family offered gentle words of love and support, but Dexter remained unseen. Not a word. Not even a photograph. Some assumed she was too overcome with grief to speak. Others believed she was simply honoring her mother's lifelong commitment to privacy. Whatever the reason, her silence became a story of its own, a daughter's quiet grief echoing through the noise of public mourning. And though the world had lost an icon, Dexter had lost her mother, her anchor, her confidant, her guiding star. No one could truly understand what that loss felt like, nor the depth of what she carried in those first few days. As tributes continued to flow and memories of Diane Keaton were celebrated across the world, Dexter's silence grew louder. It wasn't absence. It was heartbreak in its purest form, invisible, yet impossible to ignore. After the news of Diane Keaton's passing, Dexter Keaton disappeared completely. One day she was seen briefly leaving her home with her husband, her face hidden behind dark glasses. After that, nothing. No interviews, no social appearances, no online posts. It was as if she had vanished from the world entirely. Those who knew her said she had retreated inward, not out of avoidance, but out of need. Her mother had been her constant companion, her emotional center. To lose her was to lose a piece of herself. The walls of the home they shared, once filled with laughter and conversation, now echoed with an unbearable stillness. Friends tried to reach out. Calls went unanswered. Messages were left unread. She wasn't ready, not yet. She spent hours going through her mother's things. The old photographs, handwritten notes, journals filled with sketches and words of reflection. Every item was a memory, and every memory was a wound. Behind closed doors, Dexter was unraveling, not in a dramatic way, but quietly, painfully. She replayed the last conversation they'd had over and over, searching for meaning in the small details. The sound of her mother's voice, the softness of her laughter, the warmth of her last hug. Had she missed something? Had Diane tried to tell her something that night? Meanwhile, the world continued to talk. News outlets speculated about Diane's legacy, her career, her last moments, and even about Dexter's silence. Some admired her privacy, others misread it as coldness. But those who truly understood grief knew, silence isn't indifference. It's survival. In her absence, people began to feel her presence even more. The mystery around her grew, not because of fame, but because of emotion. The world could sense that something was being held back, something too fragile to be shared. And then, just when it seemed she would remain silent forever, a single message appeared, one that would change everything. It was brief, heartfelt, haunting, and it would send shockwaves across the world. For days after her mother's passing, Dexter Keaton sat in silence inside her Los Angeles home, the same home Diane had helped her decorate years ago. The air still carried traces of her mother's perfume, a soft mix of cedar and something floral that lingered in the corners like a ghost. Everywhere Dexter looked, there were reminders, framed photos from movie premieres, birthday cards Diane had written in her unmistakable handwriting, and a half-read book on the coffee table that now felt sacred. She picked up an old voicemail on her phone, one she had saved unknowingly for a moment like this. "Hey honey, it's me. I just wanted to hear your voice." The message was short, ordinary, yet now unbearably precious. The world outside was still reeling, headlines were everywhere, but inside her home, time had stopped. Dexter replayed that voicemail 3 times, then scrolled through her texts, and there it was, the last message Diane had ever sent her. "Dinner soon? I have something to tell you." The dinner never happened. The words "something to tell you" now echoed in Dexter's mind like a secret she'd never uncover. She walked into her mother's study, untouched since that final day. On the desk was a notebook Diane used for her thoughts. Quotes, sketches, little reminders. And on the very last page, written in her mother's looping handwriting, was a line that made Dexter's heart stop. One day, she'll understand why I smiled through the pain. No one else knew about that page. Not yet. It would take Dexter days to even process what it meant, but even then, she wasn't ready to speak. Not to the press, not to the public. Only silence surrounded her. By the 5th day, grief had turned to a strange, unbearable stillness. Flowers flooded the front porch. Messages poured in from friends, colleagues, and strangers who had loved Diane from afar. Dexter didn't answer the door. She couldn't. Each note that read "she'll be missed" felt like another wound. But behind that silence, something else stirred: regret. There had been moments between them that Dexter now replayed endlessly, a half-finished conversation, a disagreement that now seemed meaningless, an unanswered call she had planned to return the next morning. People around her tried to console her, telling her it was normal to feel this way. But Dexter knew her pain was different. It wasn't just about losing a mother. It was about losing a chance to say one more thing. Something simple, maybe, but final. She knew, Dexter whispered one night to a close friend over the phone. She knew something I didn't. What do you mean? Her friend asked gently. Dexter didn't answer. The words hung there, heavy and uncertain. She wasn't ready to explain. Maybe she didn't even fully understand. But she could feel it. Her mother's calmness in those final days hadn't been accidental. Somehow, Diane had been preparing her for something. The world had been waiting. Reporters, fans, friends. Everyone wanted to hear from Diane Keaton's daughter. On the 5th night after her mother's death, just before midnight, Dexter finally broke her silence. On her Instagram page, quiet since before the tragedy, a simple post appeared. I never thought silence could hurt this much. Now I understand what she was trying to tell me all along. She knew before I did. No photo. No hashtags. No caption explaining it further. Within minutes, the post spread across the internet. It was raw, haunting, and deeply human. Fans flooded the comments with condolences and confusion. Some saw it as a poetic tribute. Others felt a chill, wondering what Dexter meant by "she knew before I did." Did Diane sense something before she passed? Was there something left unsaid? The post became headline news overnight. Entertainment reporters replayed it on morning shows, voice trembling as they read it aloud. One host whispered, "It's not just grief, it sounds like revelation." But Dexter didn't respond. After posting those few lines, she disappeared again, leaving the world to guess what she truly meant. By the next morning, Dexter's words were everywhere. Analysts, journalists, and even grief counselors weighed in. Everyone wanted to decode her message. "She's speaking from trauma," one expert said. People often search for meaning when faced with loss. But others weren't so sure. The phrasing, "she knew before I did," seemed deliberate, like a clue. Some fans began re-watching Diane's recent interviews, searching for signs. In one clip, Diane spoke softly about life, legacy, and letting go. In another, she smiled when asked about aging, saying, "I think I've made peace with what's coming." Had she known something was wrong? Dexter's post had turned private grief into a public mystery. Yet to her, it wasn't about headlines. It was about truth, the painful kind that only reveals itself in the echo of silence. Late that night, she sat on her mother's porch, reading the flood of messages. One caught her eye. "She raised you to be strong, Dexter. Don't be afraid to share her light." Dexter closed her eyes. For the first time, she realized what her mother's final words might have meant, that even in silence, there was a message meant only for her. While the public speculated, those closest to Diane understood what Dexter was going through. Family members and lifelong friends, people who had been in Diane's life long before Hollywood, gathered quietly to comfort her. One friend, who had known Diane for more than 30 years, said softly, she adored Dexter. Everything she did, every decision, was about her. They shared stories, like how Diane would leave little notes in Dexter's lunch bag when she was a child, or how she would stay up late helping with school projects, even after filming all day. She used to say Dexter was her real masterpiece, another friend recalled through tears. Inside the family home, Dexter found more of her mother's writing. Journals filled with observations about life, art, and motherhood. One passage stood out. Being a mother doesn't end when the child grows up. It just becomes quieter, more invisible, but never less powerful. Reading those words, Dexter finally broke down. She realized her mother's presence hadn't vanished. It was all around her, in her handwriting, her laughter caught on video, her warmth embedded in every corner of their home. The world saw a Hollywood legend. Dexter saw the woman who taught her how to see beauty in imperfection. And now, just 5 days after losing her, She was beginning to understand that her mother's final message wasn't a mystery at all. It was love, quiet, enduring, and eternal. By the sixth morning, the light outside Dexter's window felt different, quieter, heavier. The media vans were still parked at the corner, waiting for a glimpse, a sound, anything. But Dexter wasn't thinking about cameras. She was thinking about breakfast. About how her mother used to hum while making coffee, or how she always burned toast because she was too busy reading the newspaper. It was those small details, the ones no one saw, that broke her the most. That afternoon, Dexter finally stepped outside. She didn't speak to reporters, but she stood in the sunlight for a moment, almost as if to remind herself that the world was still turning. Later that evening, she agreed to a short recorded interview, her first since the tragedy. It wasn't for fame or control, or even clarity. It was because she felt she owed her mother that much. Her voice trembled, but her words were real. "You think you're ready," she said quietly. "You think you've prepared yourself for the day you'll have to live without them. But you're not. You never are." She paused, looking down at her hands. "I keep hearing her voice, telling me to be brave. But I don't know what bravery looks like right now." It was raw. It was honest. And it broke everyone's heart. For the first time, fans saw beyond the name, beyond the fame. They saw a daughter who had lost her mother only days ago and was now struggling to hold on to pieces of a life that no longer made sense. The interview ended with one final question. If you could say one more thing to her, what would it be? Dexter looked up, eyes glistening. "I'd tell her I finally understand what she meant by silence." Chapter 13. The shock nobody expected. The morning after her interview aired, the world woke up to a headline that no one saw coming. Dexter had released another message, this time through a handwritten note shared with a close friend who later posted it publicly with her permission. It read, "Before she left, my mother said something I'll never forget. She said, 'You'll find me in the quiet things.' At the time, I didn't understand. Now I do. Every sound in this house feels like her voice. Every still moment feels like her arms. She was trying to tell me goodbye, without saying the word." The world stopped again. That line, "She was trying to tell me goodbye without saying the word," hit millions like a wave. It was heartbreaking, but also beautiful. A quiet revelation that Diane Keaton had somehow, in her own graceful way, prepared her daughter for a loss she knew was coming. The internet exploded. Fans flooded social media with tributes and stories about how Diane's films had shaped their lives. Even Hollywood veterans admitted they'd never heard something so deeply human from a grieving child of fame. Dexter hadn't intended to shock anyone, but her words did. They peeled back the curtain on a private world of love, loss, and the kind of understanding that only comes after death. By the seventh day, the shockwaves had reached every corner of Hollywood. Directors who had worked with Diane for decades began to share stories the public had never heard. Small glimpses into the woman behind the legend. One filmmaker recalled how Diane often stayed behind on set after filming wrapped, sitting alone with a cup of tea, jotting notes into her journal. "She said she liked to write down everything that made her laugh," he said. "I think that's how she kept her heart light." An old friend from her Something's Gotta Give days remember her quietly saying, "I hope Dexter never has to see me weak. She's my strength, and I want her to remember me that way." As those stories surfaced, a fuller picture of Diane began to emerge. Not just the actress, but the mother, the woman, the human being who lived fiercely and loved deeply. Through tears, co-stars described her warmth, her sense of humor, her grace under pressure. Meryl Streep, one of her closest friends, released a short statement. Diane was always the one who could turn grief into laughter. She had that gift. Now it's up to Dexter to carry that light. Hollywood, for once, felt small, united not by fame or glamour, but by grief. Dexter watched all of this unfold from home, surrounded by photos of her mother's smiling face. For the first time in days, she smiled too. It wasn't a smile of joy, but of understanding, a quiet acceptance that her mother's legacy was safe, not because of her films, but because of her love. Days passed. The flowers on the porch were beginning to fade, but inside, Dexter had begun to find something resembling peace. She still cried, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes over something as small as her mother's favorite song playing on the radio, but there was a strength forming in her now. In a new message, she wrote, "I've learned something about grief. It doesn't end. It just changes shape. And love, real love, doesn't go away. It becomes part of you." Those words captured everything Diane had stood for: resilience, grace, and the ability to find beauty in imperfection. Dexter began organizing her mother's journals and old photographs, deciding that one day she would share them with the world. Not for publicity, but as a way to show who Diane truly was. the mother who had always found joy in chaos, art in imperfection, and hope in heartbreak. When asked by a close friend how she was coping, Dexter replied softly, "I still talk to her. Maybe that's crazy, but I do. I tell her when I'm scared, when I'm proud, when I don't know what to do. And every time, I swear I hear her say, 'You've got this, kid.'" It wasn't closure, not yet. But it was connection. And that connection, fragile and infinite, was what kept her going. Because love, the kind that Diane Keaton gave to her daughter, doesn't fade with fame or time. It lingers, in silence, in laughter, and in the soft, unseen places where memory and heartache meet. As the world continued to mourn a legend, Dexter Keaton was quietly learning to live again. Not by letting go, but by holding on to the love that would never ever end. In the quiet of her mother's home, Dexter found what felt like a final conversation, not spoken but written. Hidden inside an old wooden chest were stacks of letters, bound by ribbon and faintly scented with perfume. Each envelope was addressed in her mother's delicate handwriting, to Dexter. She opened the first one slowly. The paper had yellowed, the ink slightly faded, but the words still carried her mother's voice, soft, strong, unmistakable. "My darling girl, if you're reading this, it means life has reminded you how fragile it is. Don't fear that. It's how we learn to love harder, live louder, and forgive faster. You were my greatest joy, not my films, not the applause, you." Tears blurred the ink as Dexter read. Every line was a reflection of their bond, honest, imperfect, real. Some letters were written when Dexter was still a child, full of advice and laughter. Others were more recent, contemplative, almost prophetic. "I hope you'll always choose laughter. Even in the hardest moments, remember that the world needs your smile." It wasn't just a mother's farewell. It was a roadmap, guiding her through the storm she now found herself in. For the first time, Dexter realized her mother had prepared her for this. The notes, the journals, the quiet looks, they were all part of a message that stretched beyond time. Every letter felt like a heartbeat, reminding her that love, once given, never truly disappears. As Dexter continued to go through her mother's things, she stumbled upon something unexpected, a folder labeled simply unfinished. Inside were handwritten pages of what appeared to be Diane's last personal project, something deeply private, never meant for the public. It wasn't a script or a memoir. It was more like a reflection, a dialogue with herself. "I've spent my life trying to understand love, not the kind that ends with a kiss, but the kind that never ends at all. Maybe that's what motherhood really is. The forever kind." Dexter read on, her eyes filling again. "If anyone ever wonders who I was, tell them I was happy. Tell them I got to be someone's mother. That's the role I never wanted to stop playing." The world had known Diane Keaton as an icon, a woman who defied Hollywood's expectations, who embraced her quirks, her independence, her truth. But these words revealed something deeper, her quiet longing, her self-awareness, her gratitude. She hadn't been afraid of time. She had embraced it. And through these unfinished writings, Dexter saw her mother not as the star the world celebrated, but as the woman who had found meaning in simplicity, the kind of meaning that fame could never give. It was then Dexter understood that her mother's final gift wasn't her films or her fame. It was perspective. There was a place that belonged only to the two of them, a small grove of trees overlooking the Pacific, where Diane used to take Dexter for long walks. It was where they shared secrets, laughed about nothing, and spoke about everything. Now, standing alone in that same spot, Dexter felt the wind rush through her hair, the same wind her mother used to say carried memories. She sat down on the grass and placed one of the letters beside her. Her voice trembled as she spoke aloud, as if her mother were still listening. "You told me to find you in the quiet things. I think I finally understand. You're in this air, in this light, in every piece of my heart that still beats." Her words dissolved into the wind, carried toward the sea. In that moment, something changed. The grief didn't vanish, but it softened. The pain didn't leave, but it became bearable. Dexter wiped her tears and smiled faintly, her mother's words echoing in her mind, "You'll find me in the quiet things." This was her goodbye. Not an ending, but a promise, to keep living, to keep remembering, and to keep carrying her mother's light. In time, Dexter began to share small pieces of her mother's writings, not for attention, but to help others who had faced similar loss. She launched a project in her mother's honor, built around a simple idea, finding beauty in imperfection, just as Diane always had. It wasn't a foundation or a campaign, it was a movement of love, reflection, and healing. People from all over the world began writing to Dexter, sharing their own stories of grief, resilience, and rediscovery. Her words had reached far beyond Hollywood, touching hearts in ways she could never have imagined. She often quoted her mother's line that had once puzzled her. "Silence can hurt, but it can also heal. Through that message, she reminded people that grief doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning to live with the echo of love. And somewhere deep within she felt proud, not just of her mother but of herself. Because she was doing what Diane would have wanted, turning pain into purpose and silence into strength. As the world moved forward, Diane Keaton's laughter, words, and wisdom continued to echo through time, not just in her films, but in the life of her daughter. Dexter became the keeper of her story, not as a celebrity's child, but as a woman who had walked through heartbreak and found light again. In one of her final public statements, she wrote, "My mother once told me that love is like light, it doesn't end when you close your eyes. It just becomes something you feel instead of see." Those words would be quoted by millions, not as a celebrity tribute, but as a universal truth. In every frame of Diane's old movies, every photograph, every laugh that still echoed in people's memories, there was life. There was spirit.
There was her.
And standing quietly behind it all was her daughter, the voice that had once been silent, now carrying a message that reached beyond grief. Diane Keaton had left behind more than fame, more than fortune. She had left behind understanding that the beauty of a life isn't in how it ends, but in how deeply it was loved. And as Dexter Keaton finally closed her mother's last journal, she whispered the words that would live forever in the hearts of millions.
She's not gone.
She just went home. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Because behind every headline is a human story, one of love, loss, and the strength it takes to keep going when the world falls silent. Diane Keaton's life was more than fame, it was a lesson in grace, laughter, and the power of love that outlives everything else.